Well, we want to welcome everybody here to our webinar this morning. My name is Steve Holmes. I'm an application engineer working with Leader Electronics, and just want to thank everybody for attending this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you may be. Please enter any questions that you have in the chat window, and we will address those questions at the end of the seminar. So I just want to thank you very much for being with us today. A lot of things have taken place in the HDR world. HDR has been done in several different ways. The DSLR folks have done it for years using two pictures. They'll take an overexposed picture, they'll take an underexposed picture, run it through some software, combine it, and come out with just an absolute gorgeous looking picture. Unfortunately, in the video industry, we don't have that luxury. We have to be able to do it all at one time. There are two basic parts to looking at HDR. We have the camera and we have the monitor or the display. In the monitor, we need to be able to display the range of material that is presented to the monitor, not just making things brighter with no more resolution, but HDR is all about being able to show the data that used to get rolled off in the camera's knee, all of the specular highlights, increasing the dynamic range. In the camera, the goal is to get more f-stops, wider dynamic range with more data in that dynamic range. And you'll hear the term HDR and SDR. SDR is for standard dynamic range. One of the things we run into is there is a tendency for folks doing HDR to want to make things brighter. And that's not what HDR is about. 90% reflective white, somebody's got a white dress shirt on, should come out at the same brightness it does right now on SDR. HDR is about being able to take those speculars that show up and be able to show those. So looking at this, an SDR picture would look like the one on the left, where the room is well lit and you can see the room very well. But HDR gives us the ability to take that data that's getting blocked or getting rolled off in the highlights and be able to show that data as well. So in the camera, we typically will use a log curve. The log curve maximizes the image sensor to be able to get the greatest number of f-stops. In the monitor, we utilize an HDR curve, which will give us the greatest contrast and make it to what the human eye wants to see and what the human eye can see. We've dealt with different gamma curves forever, starting with standard definition TV. We've always had the 1886 SDR gamma curve. What gamma curves are all about is if we were to shoot video absolutely linear and try to reproduce that video on the other side in order to get the full effect and be able to see exactly what was shot with all of the detail, and in this case to get about 100 steps or 100 gradations, it would take 16 bits of data to be able to get about 100 steps of definition. One of the things that the gamma curve gave us, that the CRT not being driven as a current drive, but being able driving that as we always have as grid bias, gave us this gamma curve. And what the gamma curve allowed was we could get that same 100 steps in only 7 bits of data. So the whole key of this is so that the human eye sees exactly what's in the set exactly on the screen. So it's a one-to-one show of what's going on. So what we have is on the camera side, we have what they call an optoelectric transfer function, or OETF, which is the gamma curve applied in the camera. We have the inverse of that gamma curve, the EOTF, which is the electro-optical transfer function in the display, which gives us that linear response. So what's in the scene is exactly what the viewer ends up seeing. In dealing with HDR, we don't deal with it in percentage anymore like we've done in standard definition and HD, where we're looking at 0 to 100% and looking at everything. We deal with things in terms of nits, or candelas per meter squared. A nit and a candela per meter squared are exactly the same. It's just easier to deal with nits, and in the United States at least, nit has become the normal term that we use for measuring the amount of light. In Rec 709, it was designed around 700 millivolts as our 100% reference, which gave us roughly 100 nits output bright white. In HDR, that same 90% reflective point, they've moved it up a little bit to about 203 nits. So somebody that would be coming in at 100 nits on SDR should be coming in at about 203 nits for HDR. So if we look at a room here, there's different things in this room. Like if we look at the lighting in the top, lighting can be anywhere from 15 to 5,000 nits. So it can vary greatly in how much light we have in something. You deal with sunlight, sunlight coming through those shades, where those shades slightly drawn, is still about 500,000 nits. Bright sunlight can easily reach 1 million nits or 1 billion nits, just depending on how bright the day happens to be. Standard LCD style televisions give us around 200 nits maximum brightness. So a normal SDR TV would give us somewhere between 100 to 200 nits for full white. Most laptops are at least 200 nits. Some of them go up a little bit higher than that, but most of the brightness off of most laptops is right around 200 nits. Things down in the shadows will be well below 1 nit. So the human eye can see way, way, way below 1 nit. And one of the things that HDR does is it does give us more detail in those dark areas also. When I was at CES this year, there was a lot of talk on different monitor technologies. I'll just hit this lightly. The mini LEDs and the micro LEDs were the big things this year. Mini LEDs are actually just backlit LCDs, but instead of having like 6 to 10 zones in the back of the screen, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of individual lighting zones. So the lighting zones have gotten much smaller. Micro LEDs will probably become the replacement for OLEDs. Micro LEDs are the same size TV sets that we have today, but actually using conventional LEDs. They're just incredibly small. The nice thing about that, that'll get rid of any of the burn-in effects we've had for years. From all of my dealings and from what I'm seeing out in the industry, there's 4 different basic concepts of HDR. 3 of them are PQ, and 1 of them is HLG. So the PQ curve, the ST2084 curve that came out of Dolby, can go out with absolutely no metadata at all. And that was brought to us from the UHD Alliance. The ST2084 curve, the PQ curve with static metadata, is what is used in HDR10. And I'll go over these in just a little bit. And then there is the 2084 curve with dynamic metadata. So out of the dynamic metadata, there's 5 big ones out there, and really the top 2 are the only ones you're really going to find that really any TV set's going to respond to. And that happens to be the Dolby Vision or HDR10 Plus. So the ITU came out with a UHD standard in 2015, and they had the recommendation of BT 2020, which also gave us color space. But it also recommended 2 different HDR curves. The first one was the perceptual quantizer, which was the PQ curve, and the second one was the hybrid log gamma. So if we look at the HLG curve is used a lot for live broadcasts, especially sporting events. One of the advantages of the HLG curve is it is backwards compatible with SDR. So if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, you'll see that the red is the standard SDR curve going to 100%. So what HLG does is the bottom half up to 50% is that standard gamma curve. From 50% up, it's a log curve. And basically all it's doing is taking the data that would normally be rolled off in the knee of the camera and giving us the ability to show that specular highlights. Since the bottom half is exactly the gamma curve that is used in SD and HD, all we have to do is take HLG and basically double its amplitude and put a soft knee on the top of it, and you're right back to SDR, because the white point still should be for reflective white at the same point. So you lose very little data. All we're doing is putting the knee back in it, and we don't get those specular highlights. The perceptual quantizer, published by SMPTE 2084, which is used in Dolby Vision and used in HDR10 and HDR10 Plus, is based on human vision. So they turned around and tracked thousands of people as they saw different brightnesses. And it goes all the way out to 10,000 nits. Now, in today's use, most of us are only using about 1,000 nits of that curve. So that means that brightness goes all the way up to about 75%. At 75% of the screen is 1,000 nits, and most of the grade is done at 1,000 nits in HDR, because there's not a monitor out that can even produce 1,000 nits yet for home use. So getting out to 2,000 nits and above is a little bit off. We might be able to get there with some of the newer monitors that are coming out shortly. But the one thing that the perceptual quantizer does give us, if you know notice the curve is much straighter down near the bottom. So there's actually more detail in the blacks in the PQ curve than there is in a standard gamma curve. So if we look at the no tone mapping piece of HDR. It's just like what we do in 709 today. We make the video, it goes out to 100%. The monitor knows it goes out to 100%, and it knows exactly how to show it based on the brightness that that monitor is capable of. So in this case, you would have to tell the monitor what the grade was. In this case, it's 1,000 nit grade. And you would have to hard set the monitor, and then the monitor would adjust itself so it knows that basic white is at 203 nits, and all the specular highlights are from 203 to 1,000 nits, and it would set itself up that way. In static tone mapping, which is what's in HDR10, you send metadata to tell it what color space you're in, what level of grade you did, and that way the monitor then can automatically adjust itself based on the metadata that you sent it, and it knows if it can only go to 700 nits, it knows to be able to scale that data to fit within its brightness range that it can do. For dynamic tone mapping, you have the ability to change the metadata on a scene-by-scene basis. So with HDR10 Plus, they can turn around and send new metadata to tell the monitor to readjust this particular scene for the brightness and be able to customize it for that monitor's capabilities. Within Dolby, Dolby typically will be running on a scene-by-scene basis, but it does have the ability to do it within a scene and be able to manipulate the data as it needs to manipulate the data. So let's take a look at what this HDR waveforms look like on the LV5600. So I have an LV5600 sitting here on my desk, and we'll look at a few waveforms when we go through this stuff. So one of the first things you need to do in 4K is be able to tell the waveform monitor, how is your 4K coming into the scope? There's actually several different formats that we have available to us today. 12G puts it all in on one wire. That would be 444 data coming into us. 6G would be YCBCR data coming in on one coax. Quad 3G is a 4 independent coaxes, each giving us a quarter of the picture content. Dual 3G is the equivalent of 6G, but done on 2 wires. So it's dual link, but in 3G, but instead of the 2 links making a single picture, they're actually independent HD. So you get 2 independent HDs on one 3G link. So you can do quad in 2 cables. Quad HD would be what a lot of the data is that is for home use, because what you and I get from any of the streaming services is YCBCR data. The 444 RGB data would be for theatrical releases. And then there's IP when we start getting into 2022 and 2110. There is IP single stream, which is 12 gig worth of data. And then there is IP quad stream, where it is looking at 4 independent streams that make up, it's the equivalent of quad link coming in at either HD or 3G. Then we need to figure out what is the type of HDR. So there's PQ and HLG if we're dealing with looking at it from a monitor standpoint and doing a normal grade, or if we're going to look at the camera data, then we can look at any of the different log curves that are used. Then we need to look at what is the white point, which is typically 203 nits, but some people may want to run it back to 100 nits. But typically in today's world, it's 203 nits for the reference level. And are we dealing with narrow, which is SMPTE range, or full range, where we're going to use all 10 bits for video data? Now, in some of the newer standards, that data is being signaled in the VPID information. But that is a very, very recent change to the video payload ID. And I'd say probably 99%, 98% of the SDI that you see is not going to have that metadata sitting in it. And there's a lot of equipment that doesn't know what to do with that metadata. And since the PQ scale goes all the way out to 10,000 nits, and we're only going to typically for home use going to have a 1,000 nit grade, or if this is master content, they'll typically use 4,000 nits to master it, based on the thinking that at some point we will get brighter and brighter and brighter technology in our homes. So they want to have the extra data and then do a 1,000 nit cut off of that when they produce it for home use. We still need to deal with where is the reflective white, because remember, we aren't going to take somebody's shirt and show that at 1,000 nits. So if I got a white dress shirt on and it is giving me my 90% reflective white, that 90% reflective white still needs to come in about where we want it to come in, which is going to be right around 203 nits. But we want the specular highlights to be able to go out to 1,000 nits, be able to see this. And if you look at the waveform right now, you'll see a lot of the waveform is sitting off of black. And that's because the blacks have been stretched so much. But if you look at it, the scale on the right-hand side, the nit scale, or the candela per meter squared scale there, you'll see that it's actually well below even a half a nit. So the blacks are still very, very black, but it gives us a lot more gradation and a lot more detail in blacks, because the human eye is actually more sensitive to changes in black than we are in bright white. We can turn around and use a zoom function like you would on a regular waveform monitor on HD or something to see a particular piece and actually zoom into it. But one of the things we can do with this is actually zoom in so that now we're still looking at a 10,000 nit scale, but just put 2,000 nits at the top of the screen, and now I've got better resolution at the data I'm looking at. So I'm still going from 0 to 1,000 nits, and then with a little bit of overhead room, I can turn around and track and make my grade, make it look good. You also have the ability to change the waveform to white. You can make it multicolor, you can make it cyan, any of the colors that happens to go with what you're trying to look at. Now, full range is something that is done in post when they want to use the entire 10 bits and get the highest dynamic range from the digital data. So they'll drop, instead of having black at 64, they'll drop black at 0, and they'll take white all the way out to 1,023. So that way you have a lot more bits to deal with the data, and you have a lot more resolution in the data you're putting out. If it's a 1,000 nit grade, it's still gonna stop at 1,000 nits, roughly 75% of the way up the scale. We can also look at this data in different modes. It could be coming in YCBCR, but if you're doing color grading, you're going to want to see it in RGB so you can color grade it correctly, but you might want to see it in YCBCR. Some people like to look at things in GBR rather than RGB, so you can. Believe it or not, we can even take this and make it look like composite. Now, there is a nifty use for composite, and the use for composite is when you want to look at detail in the blacks. You can turn around and put in a Luma Chroma display where you split and look at Luma on the left-hand side, look at Chroma on the right-hand side, and you can make sure that you have no blacks in the very, very dark pieces that would be polluting your blacks that you're trying to create, and make sure we have. We can also look at a YRGB display. We can look at YRGB in multicolor, where we're looking at it colored, or we can look at it in just pure monochrome. And you can set the entire screen to monochrome if you don't want any extra color when you're doing any work with this stuff. So let's try to take a look here, and we'll look at some of this stuff. If I reset myself up here, and you should now be seeing just the waveform monitor. And if you notice right now, the waveform monitor is going to just 2000 nits. So it is zoomed out right now. So I have a PQ screen going right now, and here's the actual picture that's being displayed. And here is the 1000 nit grade that this data is actually going out to. And you'll see that it is going out there to 1000 nits and stopping right at 1000 nits. Now I can turn around and change things up as far as colors, as far as cursors. I have the cursor turned on, and so if I go in, I can change the cursor value. I like to have the cursor on because I have the cursor set right at 1000 nits, so it gives me a very nice, dark, bold line. Probably going through the system here, you're losing the graticule lines other than the 203 and the 1000 nits, but there is at each one of these nit points on the right side of the screen, there is a graticule line going across the screen that's just getting lost in the data that we happen to have on the screen. But we do have the way so I can turn around and shut the cursor off, so all you get is the 1000 nit graticule going across. But I personally like to have a nice bright point where I'm trying to go to. You do have the ability to go into some of the other screens where I can look at a vector scope. I can look at a vector scope magged out. I can look at it normal and look at the picture. Or I can look at multiple things, and I'll show you this reconfigured just a little bit. In just a little bit, we'll play with that. So I put the PowerPoint back up. The other thing that we can turn around and look at here is HLG. In doing HLG, remember the bottom half up to 50% is a 2.4 gamma or normal 709 gamma curve. And then from 50% up to 100% is our specular zone. So normally in the case of HLG, the entire waveform will be used. 1000 nits will be the 100% mark over on the right. And 203 is still going to be our reference point. So sitting here right in the middle, so normal everyday reflective white should still be coming in at 203. And the only thing that should be going above that is all of the specular highlights, the things that would be reflecting very brightly off of chrome or off of something that would normally be above 100% in a shot. So if we look at it, you'll see, like I said, roughly most of the data is right around 203 nits that it's coming in. And this particular shot was coming from this scene right here, where the clouds and a little bit of the reflection of the clouds in the water are the specular highlights in this shot. The rest of the data is coming in exactly where you'd expect it to. And if you notice, the blacks are going all the way down to 0 because they aren't stretched out like they would be in PQ, because the bottom half of this is a normal everyday curve. So I'm just trying to reconfigure my player here to be able to look at some HLG and put the waveform monitor on HLG, and we can turn around and take a look at this. For the waveform monitor, there it is. So this is the scene that I was looking at, where the clouds in the top up there were the specular highlights that were going above 100% reflective white, or 203 nits. And then down in the bottom, it's rolled off a little bit in the camera shot off of this thing. Down in the bottom, the reflection off of the water is the other piece of data that is part of the specular highlights, where it's reflecting off of the bottom. So you can look at this and see where that same exact shot is, and then we can look at where the pieces are actually coming from. So one of the things we want to know is, like I said, I know where that specular data is coming from, because there's extra tools available to us that will actually turn around and look at this data and allow us to see things and be able to look and see within a given shot, where are the specular highlights, like those headlights, which would normally be going over, or the lights in this scene that would normally be going over the normal reflective white point. So if we go back here and go back to our presentation, there is a complete set of tools available to us to be able to look at HDR and be able to look at it in several different ways. One of them happens to be the CIE chart. So you can set up a CIE chart, and you can put the diamonds on the screen for the color volumes that you are dealing with, either 709, 2020, DCI, P3 space, or you can actually build custom triangles and set your own white point and your own color points within them, so that you can look at how much color volume am I actually putting out, and where is that color volume. So there are several points on there, as you can see, coming in, that you can set the triangles up for. Now, in looking at a HDR scene, one of the things that we can use is a false color display to be able to color gradiate the levels within the scene. So on the right-hand side is the thermometer, and you can see everything that's very, very deep blue is very, very dark, very low light. Everything that is yellow is some things that are in the specular highlight range. So the things that are very light green to yellow are in the specular highlight zone. Anything that would be above the specular highlights would show up as white. And it would mean you'd need to go back and fix that particular content. If you want to know just the data that happens to be in the HDR zone, we have a modification of the false color display that we were looking at. So back here on the cine zone scene, we can turn around and make this just in the HDR area so that we can turn around and look at what content is just in the HDR piece. So in this case, my reference is at 201.67, right around 203 nits, but the upper level is 1,000 nits. So anything above 1,000 nits is going to go bright purple. Anything below the specular zone is just black and white. So you can tell exactly what data that you have placed into the specular zone and how much have you pushed it into the specular highlights. Because one of the things we also have to track is you can't have too much data on the screen in the specular highlights, because typical TV sets can do about a max of 20% of content somewhere in the specular zone. They just don't have enough power to be able to drive the entire screen at full brightness. We can also use a function that we call CineLight. And CineLight gives you the ability to be able to put cursors on the screen. You can have from 1 to 3 cursors on the screen. You can choose the types of units displayed on each one of those cursors. And the cursors can be a 1x1, a 3x3. They can be different sizes. And so you can turn around if there's a spot on the screen that you want to know what is my value. I can see it in percentage. I can see it percentage of RGB. I can see it percentage of RGB in an 8-bit world, 255. I can look at CV, which is YC data. Or what I like to do, because that's what I'm curious about, is where am I in the HDR zone? Am I above my 200 nit point for my brightness? There is also different types of metadata that we can tell within the waveform monitor. Now, 90% of the metadata is actually created when the content is digitized and compressed. That's when the metadata for the TV set is typically added to the HDR. In the case of Dolby Vision, it goes into Dolby's box. Dolby has their magic sauce inside their box. It will add the metadata to it. It'll do the scene change and adjust it for what it feels is the best outcome for that particular scene. In the case of like HDR10, it's going to look at it and set the metadata, put the metadata in the MPEG data and send it on out. That data then will go up the HDMI to the TV set and set the TV set. One piece of data that we can tell here on a particular scene happens to be max CLL and max fall. So max CLL is maximum content light level. So it will tell you anywhere within that shot, a single pixel, what was its absolute brightness. The max fall is looking at the average frame light within a scene. Now, the average frame light, to me, is a lot more useful than the max CLL, because one of the problems with max CLL is a single pixel will turn around and trigger it. So if you look at this scene on the left-hand side, here's the waveform for the scene on the right. And the waveform says this thing's not going above 1,000 nits. But if you look at the max CLL in the picture, you'll see that it's going up to 1,304 nits. Somewhere there is a rogue pixel that is going above 1,000 nits. These can be very difficult to find, and that's where it's really handy to be able to use a tool that will turn around and do a hard cap and actually cut the data off and make it 1,000 nits, that anything goes above that will not go. One of the reasons here, so this is where it says it's going up to 1,304, 1,306 nits. It says it's going that much higher than what the data actually is showing in the waveform monitor. One of the issues is we're looking at 4K data. The screen resolution on a waveform monitor at best is 1920 by 1080. Within each one of the RGB pieces, we happen to have 3840 pixels. So there's 3,840 pixels in just that one little bit of space. We would need somewhere in excess of 12,000 pixels of screen resolution to be able to take that 3840 and give us pixel accurate representation on the screen. It just isn't going to happen. So there is some subsampling that takes place, which does make it a little hard to find some of this data and what's going on. I turned around and made a waveform here that was exactly 1,000 nits. I put a little black stripe in the middle of it, and you can see that it is hitting right at the 1,000 nit screen, and it came out right at 1,000 nits. Now the max fall, if I didn't put this black stripe down the middle of it, the max fall would read exactly what the max CLL reads. So just to make sure max fall is working, I put just a little bit of black in there. So the total screen average is going to be less than what the max CLL is. So these guys can turn around and screw up things. So you got to be careful, because if the max CLL goes out really high, even though the content's much lower, it can change how a monitor sets itself up. The metadata going out is actually carried in the SEI messages of H.264 and H.265. This would be the total messaging that would be put into that data going out that goes up HDMI and tells the monitor where it wants to set itself. So the RGB values are saying, what is my primaries for where's my white point, and where are those RGB points. And if you look at that, it also says down below that the color primaries are BT 2020. So those values actually represent BT 2020 RGB points and the white point. It says the minimum light in the clip that this was taken from hit 0, and the maximum hit 1,000 nits. And the maximum content level, so that's set up for the grade, so the content actually hit up to 800 nits. And the average of any scene was about 400 nits in what was going on. So let me see if we turn around and put the camera back up. See if I can stop this guy on the scene I want to look at. Right there. And we go in and look. So we can turn around and look at a complete false color on this, but if we want to look at the HDR zone, here's where you can tell the data that was in that same shot that I said was from the clouds, and what you can't see too much off the bottom of the picture is where the reflections are in the water sitting on the very bottom of this particular scene. If I change my clip out here to a different clip, give me 2 seconds here, turn around and pull up the piece of content I want. So if we were to turn around and look at this particular content in 4K, we can turn around and look at the total cine zone that we were looking at. Then we can look at HDR zone, and you can see the data that is just in that particular fire stick and where it happens to be going. And you can see just the data that you've placed in the HDR. We can also turn on the max fall, max CLL, and up off the top of the screen, my little HDMI box is clipping me. It's coming out to about 1500 nits. So even though the waveform looks perfectly right at 1000, there's actually some rogue pieces, little tails that are actually going out to about 1500 nits. So even though my line right now is at 1300, it's going well above that. So we can turn around and see a lot of these functions that are actually very helpful to us. So you have standard functions being able to gain up or gain down the vector scope, be able to look at things. One of the beautiful things here is we can go into a scene, we can look at a scene, and if it's not configured how you want to have it configured, you can go into the layout and I can get rid of this piece. I don't want eye up there. Let's say I want to see vector. I'd like to see vector, and I can turn around and pull the vector scope over where I'd like it to be. And then down here, get rid of that piece and say, I'd actually like a slightly different view of a vector scope and like to be able to see the CIE chart. Yeah, let me go up to this one. I need to reconfigure that. You put just the vector scope up there. So add the vector scope, pull it over, and then I'd like to turn around and add the CIE chart, add it, pull it down. If I'd like it, I could resize it, I could leave it like that, and turn around and save that. And now I have my vector scope sitting there and the CIE chart along with my picture and my waveform. And then you can resize these, pull them around, move them. Whichever one you put in last becomes on top. So if I rolled these the other way, then the complete vector scope would be sitting on top of that blank space above the CIE chart. So I hope you have enjoyed today's presentation. I hope you got some good information out of this whole thing, and we'll ask Cindy to come online and see what questions we've got we can answer.
Hey, Steve, you're amazing. You've got so much great info, and people want more info from you. So, can the scope display multiple vector scopes, one normal and one with the gain raised at the same time? That's one of the questions.
In HD, it can, but in 4K, it cannot. It's got to use all of its engines to make a 4K signal. But if we go in HD, we could set up, so if you're doing like HLG and it's an HD feed, it can have both of those, but in 4K, it uses all of its engines to make 4K. So unfortunately, it cannot.
Okay, good to know. And someone noted that it appeared that your signal was being sent to monitors that can decode the HDR signal. And the question is, if you don't know what kind of monitor you're sending to, do you still need to go ahead and send it in SDR?
You still should announce what grade you're going to. So like if you're coming off of SDI and you're going to like an AJA high 5 and you're going out HDMI, you should set up the high 5 to turn around and put in the metadata for the monitor. Or otherwise you have to go in and find where the adjustments are in the monitor to set it up to the grade that you're actually sending it for to resolve the picture correctly.
Wonderful. And what is the level of gray 18% in the waveform monitor if one is monitoring HDR ST 2084? And we could circle back on that too.
Yeah, I'm actually going to have to look that one up. I don't remember off the top of my head. I've got it in some notes.
Yep.
We will get that data back to them.
We'll circle back to you.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And then another question is about the scope. And does it offer an alarm or error log that would track when there's too much specular highlight content, and other alarm presets for this that would reflect various networks or streaming services, those specs in regard to how much highlight content can be within a shot? A little more to that. On the Sony BVM monitors, they have a flashing blue light on the monitor when it's being overdriven. So is there something similar to that in the leader scope?
There is not for specular. For 709 content, there is the 5-bar display that will give you the data for if you are going out. We are looking at more tools to add, and the percentage of stuff you've got in specular highlights is one that I am pushing for. So I look forward to that in probably a future release.
Nice, nice. And we have another question here asking if you might explain metadata creation and management in a live multi-camera show, which sounds like a big question. So I'll just throw that to you and know that we could circle back on that as well. Up to you.
Typically in a live show, you'd be using HLG. HLG uses no metadata. So as soon as it's HLG, the values are fixed. So there is no metadata needed for the monitor. So once it goes out and IDs itself as HLG, you're done. Nothing else needs to be sent. If you are doing PQ, then you're probably going to do static metadata because the Dolby metadata piece is an offline process that takes time because it's got to inspect each one of the scenes and then turn around and make its decisions. So right now, if you were doing PQ, it would be static metadata for live presentations also.
Gotcha. And is there any clipper in the scope that can be used in the color correction chain? Something like an automated clipping function that the colorist can set up?
In the colorist tools, yes. Just like you do for, you know, putting on, you know, a safe action, a safe level, you can set a clipper in almost all of the tools that anything above a given level is clipped off. But where they are exactly, I don't know in each tool set.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And for people who want to get the white paper that Steve excerpted today, here's a link in the chat where you can sign up for it, or you can just ping Steve and let us know. Filling out the form will get you the white paper immediately.
It's an outstanding white paper. So we do have a beautiful white paper on HDR. It goes over a lot of what I went over in a lot more detail because we've got a lot more room to be able to do it and give you a lot of detail on what's going on in the HDR world.
And we will have a recording of this webinar up on the Leader YouTube channel. We'll email you all when it comes out. And here's a link to the Leader channel as well, so you can jump on there anytime you like and see Steve's webinar from January as well. We do have a comment back to you, Steve, that that probably only Grass Valley cameras employ HLG and the others are using some form of PQ. And comment back to you on that.
Okay.
Excellent. That's all the questions. Over to you, Steve.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for stopping in and seeing the presentation. Like Cindy said, if you've got questions, send us an email and we will definitely get back to you and answer your questions. The one on the 18% off just the top of my head, I can't remember. That's why God made PDFs, so I can go back and look it up. I don't have to remember all this. So I will get that data out to you. So thank you very much and have a great rest of your day, folks. We'll talk to you.